Good morning, and thank you, Bell Choir, for a wonderful opening. Welcome to the First Unitarian Church of Cincinnati. My name is Lou Kerr, and I'm your worship associate this morning. Our church is a place you can bring your whole self, your full identity, your questioning mind, and your expansive heart. We are a community committed to social justice and to supporting the various spiritual and ethical paths of our members and friends. We welcome you warmly and invite you to join us for coffee hour after the service in the room across from our main entrance. Please be sure to read the announcements and inserts in today's order of service, where you can find important information regarding accommodations in our building as well as upcoming events. There were supposed to be flowers up here, but there aren't. But if there were, they were from Mary Mark, who says that she'd dedicate this bouquet of flowers to Women's History Month and to the valuable contributions of women in society for which they are still paid less than men. And now it's time to greet our neighbors, so wave to the public, and then stand up and greet each other. And while Joan and Jesse light the chalice, I'll share a reading by W.E.B. Du Bois. Now is the accepted time, not tomorrow, not some more convenient season. It is today that our best work can be done, not some future day or future year. It is It is today that our best work can be done and not some future day or future year. It is today that we fit ourselves for the greater usefulness of tomorrow. Today is the seed time. Now are the hours of work, and tomorrow comes the harvest and the playtime. And now we will hear a board moment from Patty Kelly.
Okay, sorry, Lou. Okay, All right, good morning, everyone. I am here to talk to you this morning about the importance of fellowship in building beloved community. We talk about beloved community a lot, and there are, of course, many ways to develop that. It's important to worship together, to talk, as people have been happily chatting before worship. It's important to be in book discussions together and other programs. It's important to volunteer together at the food pantry or whatever else. But one of the best ways we have here to build community is to get to know each other through social events. And we really can't understate the importance of these events. Several people have told me how instrumental they felt our monthly potlucks were in bringing this church back to life after COVID. And I hardly agree. That's why I've been involved with community builders for several years. What people don't understand, I think, sometimes is that these things don't happen magically. I think our events are very highly appreciated and often highly taken for granted. And we are very fortunate to have good volunteers to help step up to the plate to set up and clean up events. But that's the tail end of planning events. You have to schedule them. You have to make sure the tables and chairs are set up. You have to publicize them. These things are not difficult, but they're necessary. And most of these events have been planned by the same 3 or 4 people for years. And unfortunately, this is just not sustainable. So we are reaching out to you to point out that if you truly value fellowship, that you get involved. And there are ways that we're going to make this easier. Everyone thinks, oh no, I don't want to go to another monthly meeting, but that's truly not necessary. First of all, we've separated out the publicity tasks from the chair's responsibilities, and Allison Irwin has very graciously agreed to do that for us. Ellen Wathen has stepped up to volunteer to be chair next year, so we're set for leadership. What we need is people to help plan, and this can be one event in a year. We had several people come to the table that Ellen was staffing last week and volunteer. Rebecca Messenger said she'd planned a chili cook-off. Doesn't that sound like fun? I know you used to do that. Claire Danzel did the Secret Valentines this year, but she didn't have to come to meetings month after month. For several years, Carol Willis has generously spent time twice a year organizing the circle gatherings, which we're still having people sign up for just now. These are discrete tasks that people can do on their own time, at home, and it's over and done. So if you want to help sustain our really healthy fellowship, if you like to schedule winter hikes, or as Patricia has done, or bike rides, choose your passion. But we really need more people to help, because I truly feel that if we want to have beloved community, we need to continue to spend time together, and we hope you will help us do that. Thanks.
Okay, and now we will sing hymn number 298. And now please rise as you are willing and able to sing our first hymn in the gray hymnal, Wake Now My Vision.
This is a bit different. So hopefully, because I know everybody reads the announcements that go out all the time, you're aware this is a dialogue sermon today with Tim and myself. Prior to that, though, we're going to do a meditation. Centering silence or meditative silence isn't listed in the order of service, but following the meditation, we are going to take some time for meditative silence, which I'll mark at the beginning and the end by hitting our singing bowl. The meditation today, a little lengthy, 3 or 4 minutes, depending on how fast I read it, is from an anonymous mystical text of the 13th, maybe 14th century, called The Cloud of Unknowing. It is a Christian mystical text. And the author is unknown, but the author is clearly writing to novices that are in the monastery or spiritual community with him. And I consider The Cloud of Unknowing, if you're willing to slog your way through medieval, romantic, sexist language, if you can slog your way through that and not get too triggered by it, after all, it was 600 years ago, it's a great, exquisite instructional guide for how to do contemplative method. And it's basically an instructional guide about how to get empty, which is a phrase you hear or a term you hear when you talk about Buddhism, for instance, or any of the Eastern contemplative traditions. So if you want to just close your eyes or not, this will take a few minutes to read, and then we'll have a moment of silence. And we will consider it the yin to the sermon yang, in which Tim and I are going to indulge in a dialogue about reason. So from the cloud. But now you will ask me, how am I to think of God? And what is God? I cannot answer this except to say, I do not know. For with this question, you have brought me into the same darkness, the same kind of unknowing, where I want you to be. For though we can know the very works of God, regarding God, no one can think. Therefore, I will leave on one side everything I can think, and choose for my love that thing which I cannot think. Why? Because God may well be loved, but God cannot be thought. God may well be loved, but God cannot be thought. Indeed, God can be caught and held by love, but never by thinking. Therefore, in the work now before us, your thoughts about God must be put down and covered with what we might call a cloud of forgetting. And we should step beyond this cloud of forgetting with a devout and kindling love, for such intention directed toward God is wholly sufficient. If you want this intention summed up in a word, take a short word, preferably of one syllable. The shorter the word, the better. A word like God, or love, or perhaps some other. Fix this word fast to your heart, so that it is always there, come what may. If you work hard but a short while, you will soon find the vastness and the difficulty of this work begin to ease. Though in the beginning, when your devotion is negligible, it is hard and restricting. Later, when devotion has matured, What previously was hard becomes much easier. You may even have little effort to make, or perhaps none. For sometimes God will do all the work. In that case, you will be happy to let God have control of you. So from time to time when Tim and I are in conversation, we find ourselves talking about maybe a historical figure or a topic related to Unitarian Universalism, and one of us says, you know, we really need to get that in front of the congregation at some point. And we've had this thought several times and never took any action to do it. And not too long ago, we were talking about reason, the history of reason and the current attitude or approach to reason in Unitarian Universalism. And again, I said to Tim, we should get that in front of the congregation sometime and just sort of put it out there as grist for the mill. So today is a dialogue sermon about reason. And we honestly haven't scripted it beyond a couple of readings we're going to do to begin our dialogue, and we'll see where it goes. And so we're not really trying to present you any sort of thesis or conclusion this morning that we expect you to go away with and go on Amazon and buy 6 books and read them all because it was such an interesting dialogue sermon. You just had to do more study. The hope is that somewhere in the course of our meandering, you'll hear a thought or two that might speak to you or stick with you that you can take home and maybe cut the carrots by this afternoon. And that's it's a metaphor for saying maybe something in this sermon will stick for a while. And it might be a sentence, it might be a thought, it might be your own thought that you have that we don't even discuss, spurred on by our dialogue. Since we're talking about reason, I want to start our dialogue here by doing a reading from Earl Morse Wilbur, who was a historian, a Unitarian historian. He was at one point the president of the Pacific Unitarian Seminary, which became Star King, which is still in existence today. And in 1920, he did a lecture at the Unitarian General Assembly, is what we would call it today, called the Berry Street Lecture. So this was over 100 years ago. The Berry Street Lecture still occurs every General Assembly. And in this lecture, he talked about the importance of 3 themes that he sees as instrumental and indispensable to Unitarianism, or in today's verbiage, Unitarian Universalism: freedom, reason, and tolerance. So I'm going to read that to sort of give you a sense of where these notions come from and why they're so instrumental to our understanding of Unitarian Universalism, both historically and currently. And then Tim has a reading he's going to share, and then heaven only knows where this will go after that. So a couple of snippets, and then I'll read. One snippet from Wilbur's talk is, I'm going to discuss the outstanding elements or principles which have given Unitarianism its significance in religious history and must still largely direct it today. Elsewhere, he says, the key to our whole history is the word or phrase complete spiritual freedom. It is toward this that our leaders have struggled. And then a few paragraphs from his lecture. The achievement of this complete spiritual freedom has been accomplished in our history in 3 distinct phases. First came the revolt against the bondage to the traditional dogmas as expressed in historic creeds. Next, the realization of a conflict between Scripture and reason led to the recognition that if the soul were to be wholly free, reason must be accepted as the supreme authority. Nearly coincident with this second step, though subsequent to it logically, came the recognition of the equal authority of other people's reason, which when put into practical effect issued in the principle of mutual tolerance of differing opinions. This is freedom, reason, and tolerance. In the spiritual life, we are entitled, with proper safeguards, to trust our own religious intuitions of truth and to follow our own religious instincts. In other words, complete spiritual freedom opens the way for that free and independent type of religious experience, which, in the best sense of an abused word, may be called mysticism. Further than this, it would seem in the nature of the case impossible to go. Yet unless the spiritual life and the religious experience of us humans are to end as mere individual matters, unless religion is to be conceived as solely a relation between the soul and God, and is to the end in a life of sublimated selfishness, One further step must follow in order to justify the cost of spiritual freedom. The free vision of God must be applied to the guidance of life and the needs of our fellow humans. These are the stages, and this is the lesson of the course of Unitarian history, as I seem to grasp its essential meaning.
Okay, I'm going to give you a reading from a sermon and an article that Martin Luther King wrote in 1960, in April of 1960. And as I've said before in some of my sermons, King nearly joined the Unitarian Church in Boston. Both he and Coretta attended Unitarian services and were greatly impressed by liberal theology and liberal religion. But there was a sticking point in all of this, and it has to do with reason. And I'm going to read a section of this sermon that he wrote. And he said, "There is one phase of liberalism that I hope to cherish always. It's the devotion to the search for truth. Its insistence upon an open and analytical mind. Its refusal to abandon the best light of reason. Liberalism's contribution to the philosophical historical criticism of biblical literature has been immeasurable value to me and should be defended with religious and scientific passion." So that part he agrees with on reason. It was mainly the liberal doctrine of man that I began to question. And again, we have to accept his sexist language at this point because this was the convention. The more I observed the tragedies of history and man's shameful inclination to choose the low road, the more I came to see the depths of the strength of sin. Moreover, I came to recognize the complexity of man's social involvement and the glaring reality of collective evil. You know, these things never did work with my ear. I came to feel that liberalism had been too sentimental concerning human nature and that leaned toward a false idealism. In other places, he would use the word naive, that liberals were naive about human nature. I also came to see that liberalism's superficial optimism concerning human nature caused it to overlook the fact that reason is darkened by sin. In other words, he's saying, we're all scoundrels. If that sounds familiar to you, thanks to
A little bit.
Alex. The more I thought about human nature, the more I saw how our tragic inclination for sin causes us to use our minds to rationalize our actions. Liberalism failed to see that reason by itself is little more than an instrument to justify man's defensive ways of thinking. Reason devoid of the purifying power of faith can never free itself from these distortions and rationalizations. And in a lot of ways, what he was talking about, I think, is the fact that liberalism led particularly white America into a comfort zone that lulled us to sleep and let injustices roll right by us. And I think that's his critique of classic liberalism and his critique of the Unitarian faith and its approach to using reason as a foundational part of our understanding of the nature of humanity. So how does that jive with Morse?
Which part of it? There's a lot there. So where I'm focusing on in what you've said is, if I'm hearing it right, reason has led or enabled Unitarianism, which especially back then, but I think darn close to as much today, which is a predominantly privileged white religious movement, to an understanding of human nature that King found problematic. And on the one hand, I can certainly see why the Unitarian conception of human nature would be problematic if it lulls us into sort of a certain self-satisfaction. But at the same time, the yin to that yang, or the yang to that yin, is our principles, which are rationally determined, are important beyond the mind. And I think, for instance, of the inherent worth and dignity of every person, which I think is something King would critique. It's too optimistic of a version of our human nature. And because he could see the sin inherent in our nature. I see the inherent worth and dignity of every person as an important safeguard against the abuse of our fellow beings. And
To demonize.
Well, if we're not all inherently worthy, if a scoundrel is existentially a scoundrel, instead of a scoundrel who's just a scoundrel but still worthy, which is my version of it, you give license to separate certain humans as more worthy than others. And that's a slippery slope into dehumanization and even possibly committing acts of evil against other human beings. So where I'm at with it is, I think it's a beautiful aspirational understanding of our human nature, but I also see how King would critique it as failing to have motivated white, liberal, religious people to take meaningful action in the world as he saw it.
Yeah.
Does that?
Well, and I think King might have also looked at that first principle and said that the word equal is not present. The equal worth and dignity of all. Because in practice, the history of Unitarian Universalism, we practiced as though there were some lives that were more worthwhile, or more worthy and more dignified than others. And he would have insisted on inserting that notion of equal worth and dignity to try to temper that so that it would address the current concerns. One of the things I think that is present in the tension between the civil rights movement and the Unitarian Universalism, and it plays out today in the Black Lives Matter movement, is that many liberals, and I'm lumping Unitarian Universalists into this liberal larger category, they would see the difference between subjectivity and objectivity and trying to use reason as saying, you've got to show objectively how oppression takes place. I'm not going to take your subjective experience of racism and honor it. And that was it was like saying your personal experiences of discrimination as a person of color, your experiences of discrimination as a person with disabilities or any kind of impairment is not valid unless we can put it in an objective scientific analysis. And so many of the causes and concerns of the Black Lives Matter movement were discounted by Unitarian Universalists. And there was this notion about perfectionism that came into play here, and saying, if a movement is not perfect, in other words, if it doesn't meet all of my criteria for what is essential and what is useful, then I'm not going to support it. And that is exactly what King was referring to in his letter from the Birmingham jail. He was saying that liberals, and he was pointing a finger directly at Unitarians, Universalists at that point, that his movement was not perfect enough and that they needed to slow down because America needed to catch up. And he's challenging liberals to get off the sidelines and to get actively engaged. And in some ways, we did respond in 1965, where over 177 Unitarian Universalist ministers showed up in Selma. We had the largest representation of any religious denomination in America. And you wouldn't call us a denomination.
Association of Independent Congregations is what I would call it. Another sermon for another time.
Yes, but at any rate, there was that moment in time where the letter from the Birmingham jail actually struck home. It hit Dana Greeley, who was the president of the UUA, and he understood deeply what was going on. Another side note in all of this is that King attended Dana Greeley's church for several years while he was in graduate school, and not once did Dana Greeley ever greet him or talk with him. Coretta and Martin sat in the back of the church, attended those services, and they never were welcomed. Another thing that was lost on King, or lost on the UUA, was in 1963 at the General Assembly, when the General Assembly voted against a resolution that was presented to the delegate body that said we should encourage our churches to racially integrate. This was a suggestion to racially integrate. That was resoundingly voted down in 1963 by the UUA, saying, how dare the national organization tell us what we should do in our local congregations, because you're violating local church polity, saying that we have the right to determine how we want to worship. And if we want to exclude people of color from our worship, so be it. Ironically and tone deaf to what was going on, that vote took place within weeks of the 1963 Birmingham Children's Crusade, where police officers opened hoses on children for pushing for the integration of the schools of Birmingham. And the UUA did not hear it. The national leadership of the UUA heard it, but the delegate body voted it down.
So I question, at least somewhat, not totally, but at least somewhat, that we can point to reason as the principal impediment to Unitarians taking meaningful social justice action.
I don't know that that's
time.
necessarily a fault of reason, but it's a misapplication of reason.
A misapplication of reason. So I've been here long enough and you've heard me enough to say it probably is far more attributable to tribalism. Is much, so all human beings, we can aspire to our nobility. Notions of human nobility, notions of what it means to be in community, all sorts of wonderful aspirations that we hold. And we are still largely unacquainted with the fact that it's the instinctual life that nevertheless drives us, which is why, whether you're talking about Unitarians or Baptists or whatever the case may be, Catholics, whatever, why we so often don't walk our talk. And it is a shame that the Unitarians didn't walk their talk, but I'm not sure I would attribute that to reason.
Yeah.
There's a part of me that wants to protect reason.
Yeah.
But there's also a part of me that sees the severe limits of it, but I'm not sure what King was talking about really lays that out real well. Not to say that King was wrong, but I think that there were a lot of other factors at play.
Yeah.
And those other factors don't justify the decision-making that happened in 1963.
Yeah.
I just think it's more complex, and reason is one layer of the onion.
Yeah. Well, and I think I would concede that, because I think that I see it as a misapplication of reason. And I see it that people who have comfortable existences can use reason as a tool to stay comfortable and to not be challenged and to not insert ourselves into the world where you're uncomfortable and forced to think about every core value you possess. And I think that the tendency of people who have privilege. And I think this class difference and this privilege difference was the real reason that King couldn't bring himself to join the Unitarians in that, because he agreed with the understanding of God, he agreed with the understanding of how you apply scientific method to studying the Bible, all of that and he was a universalist. And I think in the bottom line, that's the debate that exists, that's so wonderful inside Unitarian Universalism, is that Universalism challenges the Unitarians to get real. To get off their pedestals and get real and get our hands dirty.
To elaborate on that for folks who may not know so much the historical distinction between Unitarianism and Universalism.
Historically, the Universalists were a lower class of people than the Unitarians. The Unitarians were wealthy urbanites who were business people who had made it well. You know, they talked about universal salvation, but Unitarians deep down in the 19th century knew that if Calvin really was right, that only a few get elected to go to heaven and everybody else is condemned to hell. Unitarians knew they were going to heaven because they were of that privileged class that was going to go to heaven. So they had a hedge on this whole thing, and they could talk about reason, and they could talk in high terms about this. But either way, they were good. And the Universalists challenged them on that. And in many cases, the Universalists were willing to take greater risks in the way they organized their congregations and in the way they were evangelists. Unitarians tended not to be evangelists. They just thought, well, we've got this throne, we've got this cathedral of reason, and reasonable people will come to us. We don't have to go out there and beat the bushes.
If you don't find your way here, you probably don't belong, which is still very true today.
Right.
Honestly, a lot of.
And the Universalists were very different from that. The Universalists were hardcore evangelists, and they would go into communities, and particularly if you look at areas like Ohio, Universalism was the fastest growing religion in the 19th century. By the Civil War, there were more than 60 Universalist churches in Ohio, and there were only like 12 Unitarian churches in Ohio. And if you look at that nationwide, Universalism was just growing rapidly. Their technique, and they were circuit riders, their technique was to go from one town to the next and challenge the most conservative theologian of that town, typically a Calvinist Presbyterian, challenged them to a debate. And they would use all of the arguments of reason and universal salvation, and they would build their congregations because people would see these Universalist ministers were really talented at debating skills, and they did it all the time, and so they could destroy a hardcore Calvinist in a debate and make him look pretty foolish, and they could build a congregation overnight. They would have a series of tent meetings, they would form their church, and then they would go on to the next town and do that, and then they would travel a circuit and service all of those churches once they'd done that. That was getting your hands too dirty for a Unitarian.
Well, I'm trying to remember. I don't remember who said it, but you might have to tweak this for me. How did the phrase go? The Universalists thought that God was too good to damn anybody, and the Unitarians thought they were too good to be damned by God.
Yeah, that was the Thomas Starr King
that's the distinction
quote. And Thomas Starr King, who was one of the founders of California, was a Universalist.
Yeah.
And he said, Unitarians always thought humanity was too good to condemn to hell.
Well, you can see it in just the names of the separate movements before the merger in '61. So the Unitarians were called Unitarians because they believed in the unity of God, which was a denial of the Trinity, which was a Calvin teaching. And so they were called unities. You believe in the unity of God, which was a heretical label at the time. And the Universalists believed in universal salvation because God loved everybody. And so whether you believe or not, you still get into the club when all is said and done. So they believed in a universal salvation scheme. And the difference there is that the Unitarians grounded their identity in theological debate, about the Trinity or lack thereof, which is kind of a version of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin.
Yeah.
Those kind of things are very important to the Unitarians. The Universalists were not lacking in rationality. As you said, they were very fierce debaters, but they grounded their theological debate in love.
Yeah.
And in all honesty, if we look at those two aspects of our movement, and then the merger in '61 where they came together, the reality is nobody cares about the theological doctrine of the Trinity anymore, but people still care about love. And so if there's a theology that sustains itself today for Unitarian Universalism, the only meaningful one of those two that remains is the Universalist theology. And that would have been a stronger influence on King, maybe, in sort of bringing
Right.
into than the Unitarians would have been.
Right, and he would have called himself a Universalist, and he was writing these critiques before the merger of Unitarianism and Universalism. And the Universalist Church by 1950, 1960 was almost non-existent in America, so it would have been easy for a black Baptist who was raised in a fundamentalist tradition, and he was rejecting that fundamentalist tradition, to not even know Universalism existed. But his critique was a Universalist critique of Unitarianism. And even in our own congregation's history, you can see the difference between the Unitarian position and the Universalist position. We ostensibly were an abolitionist congregation. We brought ministers to our congregation who opposed slavery. We consciously did that. But when the rubber met the road, we shied away. One of our abolitionist ministers, William Henry Channing, the nephew of William Ellery Channing, the founder of Unitarianism, came to the congregation and said, the Cincinnati Anti-Slavery Society wants to use the Unitarian Church as its base of operations and hold its meetings in our church. The church voted no. At the same time, we called ourselves an abolitionist congregation. That was part of the reason why Channing ended up leaving Cincinnati and going on. And Channing ultimately became one of Lincoln's spiritual advisors, and he was the chaplain of the House of Representatives during the Civil War and was a militant abolitionist all of his life. So our church was challenged on that, and we were so steeped in this class privilege, we didn't want to sacrifice our standing in the community by doing something that would be beyond the pale or acceptable. And the Universalists, on the other hand, were not afraid to get their hands dirty and actually engage in Underground Railroad activities because they saw that was their application of love and practice. And obviously for myself, that's the bias I have. I come to Unitarian Universalism as a Universalist. And so my frustration with Unitarianism is that Unitarians tend to be more engaged in the academic discussion of action instead of the practical application of action.
Well, and now you're sort of talking my game. The far-right conservative Christians some time ago came up with this great phrase they used to use a lot. What would Jesus do? In any given situation, what would Jesus do? I was often befuddled by their answer because I read and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I read a very different Jesus in the gospel, I think. Because when I looked at the things they were talking about and they applied the question, what would Jesus do? I came up with a different answer than they did. So I just think there are so many, Jesus is a Rorschach blot. There are so many different versions of Jesus out there. But I came up with my own version of this question. What would love do? And sometimes I have conversations with my fellow Unitarians, and by which I usually mean 90% of the time parishioners, but sometimes colleagues. And I talked about the use of the pulpit a couple of weeks ago and how I envision the pulpit in the context of my ministry. And after that sermon, I got some feedback and I really thought about things. And I said to myself, and I don't know if this is accurate or not, but I said to myself, if I am conveying the importance of love and a proper understanding of love well enough, then my congregation will know what love would do in any situation. And the action steps necessary in any situation, once you ask yourself the question, what would love do, are pretty obvious. So in a way, I sort of, after doing that sermon and saying, I don't like bringing a whole lot of politics to the pulpit because it divides people, I kind of realized, when I talk about love, I'm actually giving the recipe for the foundational motivation for how to know what action to take in the world. So in a way, I do it all the time, and it sort of dawned on me that if the message of love comes through, much in the Universalist vein, you won't sit idly by in the face of injustice, and you can take action.
Yeah.
But before, have your thought, but before we close, we've got to close in a few minutes.
Right.
I want to know if you have any thoughts about reason in Unitarian Universalism today. You decide if you want to finish your thought or go there.
I came from a Universalist Christian tradition before I became a Unitarian Universalist. And, and I know the church that I came up with, the entire national leadership of the Church of the Brethren went to prison in World War I because they refused to support what they considered an imperialist war. And that was the kind of commitment that the Universalists engaged in. But I'm going to read this Moncure Conway quote because I have to have Moncure Conway.
Say, Conway, pray tell, how did he enter this conversation?
And it has to do with today, but he said this in 1906, I think, or 1904. So long as men accept religious control not based on reason, they will accept political control not based on reason. The man who gives up the whole of his moral nature to an unquestioned authority suffers a paralysis of his mind, and all the changes of the outward circumstances of the world cannot make him a free man. I think that is the real pure application of reason in one's faith, and how that then is applied to how one lives outside the sanctuary of their faith.
So what I'm hearing in what you've said is you would agree with me that reason's indispensable.
Yes.
And I would agree with you that reason used as a justification is really an unreasonable use of reason, or rationalization to not hold yourself accountable to your core values, maybe.
It's the scoundrel's way out.
The scoundrel's way out. Yeah. Wow, that should be a song or a poem or something. Yeah.
Yeah. I have to read one more quote.
And we're going to end with your quote because we have him to
one
do.
more quote of Moncure Conway to let you know how advanced this man was. This is a quote that he wrote in an article in the Commonwealth, which was a journal, and it was published here in Cincinnati. 2 years after he left here, 3 years after he left here, in 1865, strike out the word white and the word male from our laws, and we shall reach the noblest transformation. It's pretty amazing for somebody in 1865. And he got there through reason.
Perfect capstone. All right. Hopefully there's some grist for your mill in that dialogue. Our last hymn, I don't have my order. Is it 291? This hymn is, I always imagine this hymn, we should all go to a bar downtown and sing this hymn with beer steins in our hands in the good German tradition. Die Gedanken sind frei means thoughts are free. Die Gedanken sind frei. Thoughts are free. Let's sing it like we mean it. All right, please rise as you are able.
And if Joan and Jesse will come up and extinguish the chalice. The bell is full of wind, though it does not ring. The bird is full of light, though it is still. The sky is full of clouds, though it is alone. The word is full of voice, though no one speaks it. Everything is full of fleeing, though there are no roads. Everything is fleeing toward its presence.
I did good. Good.